Hello, and thank you for joining me as we continue in our quest of discovering Christ-like qualities in King David of the Old Testament. We've been able to look at brave, God-trusting 15-year-old David, and we've seen the David who let his fear get the better of him and make disastrous decisions. And last week, we saw the David who was able to see reason and be the man God had intended him to be. This week, we again see the maturity in David, and that shows us why God anointed him to lead his people. As you know, age is not an indicator of our maturity, nor our Christian maturity. But perhaps the greatest indicator of our maturity is how we handle authority, any power we might have, and the influence we have on the people around us. Authority, power and influence. And our maturity is demonstrated when we realise and how we use these in our lives. Our maturity is on show when we are the most powerful people in the room, or the classroom, or home, or the boardroom. Few things are as repulsive as a leader, parent, boss, or politician who leverages their influence for their benefit to the neglect of those of whom they are responsible for. And few things are as inspiring as a leader who says no to him or herself in order to say yes to those of whom they are responsible. And we often don't always know how we will respond until someone hands us the keys, the title, or the crown to that power dynamic. Even in films, the characters that we adore generally are the ones that use their power wisely, work well with authority, and are gentle with the power they have over people. Because no matter who you are or where you are in your life, right now, you do have power and influence in all of your relationships. You may not have much authority, but you will be having to respond to some form of authority over you. And today I want us to explore through David how we might be the best we can be and continue to be lights in the world through our Christian maturity and Christ-like lifestyles. You may know some of David's early story that you can find in the chapters of 1 Samuel. And David was a young boy when Samuel shows up at his home in Bethlehem on a secret mission from God to find a new king, which was very odd as there was already a king on the throne. And he's sent to David's house and invites the whole family to a sacrifice supper with a purpose to look at the sons of Jesse, David's dad. Now, Jesse didn't invite David to the party. He was left outside looking after the sheep. And in 1 Samuel 16, we read that God said this to Samuel as he is working through Jesse's sons. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." How many of us get convinced by our culture that we should pick a lifetime partner by looking at how they look rather than their character or their heart? Looks that fade with age, fashions that change, but character, people's passion and their heart, that is what God encourages to look for because that's what he looks for. And Samuel is working his way through the sons of Jesse, each one in turn not being chosen. And imagine being Jesse that day. The country's prophet has turned up and is obviously doing something special, but son after son after son, they are not being chosen. And eventually Samuel says, "Are these all the sons you have?" And he goes, "No, they're still the youngest. He is tending to the sheep." And Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." And then when David turns up, he hears these words, Samuel does. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." And the curious thing here is that Samuel never mentions what he was being anointed to do. We don't know when or if David ever knew. From a young age, though, David knew he was destined for something special. And we know that about 18 months later, that his victory over Goliath made him an overnight sensation. And then for the next 7 years, David is in the good graces of the king and his kingdom. And as we learned a couple of weeks ago, David marries one of the king's daughters, and he's also best friends with Jonathan, King Saul's son. And then, as we saw last week, Saul gets threatened and jealous, and he tries to kill David. And he puts a bounty on his head. And David becomes a fugitive from the law for 8 years. And so for the next 8 years, David is on the run, hiding with his band of merry men, trying not to side with the Philistines, but at the same time, trying to stay away from King Saul and everyone who supports him. All the while knowing that God had chosen him for something special. And all the while, if you read through this incredible detailed narrative, all the while learning some extraordinary important lessons. And perhaps the most important lesson that David learned in the wilderness years was this, that it's not about me. It's not about me. It's God's will, God's way, and in God's time. And the narrative also tells us that on 2 occasions, David gets an opportunity to kill King Saul. One of them is a famous occasion where David is hiding in a cave and King Saul's men are passing by, and David's going to wait for King Saul's men to pass by, and then he'll come out of the cave with his men and they'll go in the other direction. And then right in front of the cave where David is hiding, King Saul has to go to the bathroom. Saul has to go to the loo, and he stops and he gets off his donkey, and you may know the rest of the story. He goes in the cave where David and his men are hiding. But David's men's eyes have already adjusted to the dark cave, but Saul's haven't. And Saul stops into the mouth of the cave just beyond the point where anybody else could see what he was doing, and he begins to do his business. He is in the most vulnerable position possible, and all of David's men turn to him and say, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." And David almost falls for this, and he creeps up on King Saul and is about to kill him, and then walk out of the cave, all victorious, knowing that everyone in Saul's army would immediately capitulate and declare David king. And as David is about to kill King Saul, he realizes, no, I've already done this wrong once. I've already learned this lesson the hard way. I'm not taking matters into my own hands. But David does cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And Saul finishes and gets on his donkey, and they're about to leave when David appears into the mouth of the cave. And everybody in Saul's army knows he could have taken the king's life, but that he chose not to. But David is a little bit mischievous here, and we're about to find out more about that as he walks out of the mouth of the cave and he says, "My lord the king, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers comes evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you." So basically he's got everybody's attention, and they all know that David could have killed the king that day, but chose not to. And then there's another story that's not so well known. A few months later, Saul and his army are in the desert of Ziph. It's just a wide open plain with rolling hills and virtually no trees. And David's spies, whose job it is to track where Saul is so David could avoid him, they send word to David that he's in the desert of Ziph and they're camped out for the night. And David just cannot resist. So he takes a group of men up to the hill to watch the camp where the king is. And the sun goes down and King Saul has his tent in the middle of his army. So he's completely surrounded by about 3,000 men. His spear is in the ground by his head because that's how they slept. And as the sun went down, David couldn't resist. And he turns to his friend Abishai and he says, "Abishai, I have a really bad idea. Would you be willing to join me on my really bad idea?" And Abishai says yes. So here's what happens. David and Abishai went down into Saul's army at night and are able to get close to the king where he was sleeping. Abner, who was the chief of the king's bodyguard, the one responsible for protecting King Saul, is asleep next to the king. And Abishai whispers into David's ear, "God has delivered your enemies into your hands. Now we missed this opportunity once. Now's the time to power up. Now's the time to take what's yours. God wills it." How else can we explain the fact that we're standing in the middle of King Saul's army and no one has detected us, and we are standing next to sleeping King Saul? And then Abishai says, "Now look, David, I know you've got all these religious convictions and you can't lay your hand on the Lord's anointed, but God hasn't told me I can't. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. Imagine it, David. I'll take his spear right through the heart, put it through his heart, and his eyes will be open, and the last thing he sees is you. And I'm telling you, David, when this army wakes up, they will declare you king. This is why you should read the Bible more often. It's got lots and lots of details like this in. Lots of excitement and drama. But David whispered back to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? I refuse. This is so big for us. I refuse to violate the will of God in order to gain the blessing of God. And he says to Abishai, take Saul's spear, I'll take his water jug. And they creep out of the camp and they go up the hillside and they wait for the sun to rise. And as the sun is coming up and they're just a silhouette, David just can't resist the temptation. And he begins to yell out from the hillside, Abner, the king's guard, Abner, are you missing anything? And everybody recognises David's voice and they look, and there he is silhouetted and he's holding up a spear, and it looks like he's holding up a water jug, and Abner looks around and King Saul's spear is missing and his water jug is missing. And David shouts out, you're a poor excuse for a bodyguard. I came in the middle of the night and took the king's spear, which means I could have killed the king. Abner, you deserve to die for being such a poor excuse for a bodyguard. And then David and his men disappear. David refused to replace what God had put in place. Why? God's will, God's way, in God's time. Well, eventually King Saul and his son Jonathan are killed by the Philistines in battle. The two men that stood in the way of David becoming the king. And the interesting thing is that the text tells us that David actually mourned them. And so the tribe of Judah, which was the tribe that David was from, declare him king. But Israel had 12 tribes, and Ishbosheth, who was one of King Saul's other sons, he declares himself king of the other 11. So Ishbosheth proclaims to be the king over 11 tribes, and David is now king over one tribe. And for 7 more long years, there's a conflict between the house of David and the house of King Saul. And then eventually, and throughout this conflict, David essentially just tries to stay out of the way. And people continually say to him, claim what's yours, over and over. And David is, no, it's God's will, God's timing, God's way. I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. And if Ishbosheth has been declared king by those 11 tribes, then he's king. I just need to stay out of his way. 7 years this goes on. And then finally 2 brothers sneak into Ishbosheth's house while he's taking a nap, and they murder him in his sleep. And they think they've done a great thing for David, because now, think about it, they have removed the last obstacle to David being able to be king over the entire nation of Israel. And so they cut off Ishbosheth's head and they take it to David to receive the reward and to give him the good news. That last obstacle has been removed. The Old Testament is full of beheadings. In fact, all of ancient times were full of beheadings. And when we read these stories, we think how gory and how gruesome. But here's why they beheaded people. They didn't have iPhones and nobody had a camera, and there weren't death certificates signed by someone independent. The only way to prove that someone was dead was to show up somewhere with their head or their whole body. So normally it was easier to just show up with the head. And you can imagine that here they are, all proud and ready for their reward. And David answered, as we see in 2 Samuel chapter 4. Rechab and his brother Banan, the sons of Rimmon the Beerite, as surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? At which point, the people around David are saying, how can you say Ishbosheth is an innocent man? He was claiming the kingdom that belongs to you. But in David's mind, that's not how he thought. It's God's will, God's way, in God's time. So David gave an order to his men, and they killed both of the brothers. And after Ishbosheth was dead, the other 11 tribes finally declared for David, and at last, finally, he would become the king of the entire nation. after being a fugitive for 8 years, after being at war for 7 more years with the house of Saul, the text says this: all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." What they're saying is, David, we all know who had the influence. We all know who had the power. We all know who deserved to be the king. We saw it all. There was no mystery. Everybody understood that David was destined to be king. They just couldn't understand why he didn't just grab it, why he didn't just seize the throne when he had so many opportunities. And when all the elders of Israel from all 12 tribes came to King David at Hebron to crown him, to hand him the power, in this moment, David shows his true greatness. In this moment, David applies everything he's learned in the wilderness. In this moment, he shows extraordinary maturity. Maturity he would not have had at 15 or 20, or as we saw, certainly not at 22. But the difficult lessons he's learned hiding and running from King Saul, in this moment, he would apply them and he would show his greatness. They're about to hand him the power. He's holding all the cards. His word is law. He already has the influence. He is the most powerful person in the room, even without the crown. And in this moment, the text tells us that King David made a covenant with them in Hebron. Now, a covenant is our way of thinking. It's a contract. A covenant in this context is, I'll do this if you do this, and if you do this, I'll do this. It was an agreement where King David made promises to the people, and this was completely unnecessary. He didn't need to do this. He was now the king. His word was the law. So why in the world, after being mistreated all these years, and again he's facing a group of elders who did not support him when he was on the run, he could have had his vengeance on every single one of them, except for those who were part of the tribe of Judah, but he didn't. Instead, he made a covenant with these people. Why? Because David recognized in public that he would be king under authority. In this moment, he submitted himself to God's law, which meant as a leader, he was submitting himself to the people over which he would rule. This was his way of saying, I am a king, but I am not the king. Because as we said in the first part of this series, with all of David's ups and downs and with all of his flaws, David never confused himself with the king of Israel. And they anointed him king over Israel. And David was 30 years old and he reigned over Israel for 40 years. Now here's the point. David waited. David waited 15 years for God to give him what he had been promised. It was not an easy 15 years, and during that time he learned the extraordinary lessons that would make him a good and right king. He learned that leadership is always a stewardship, and that even kings are accountable. And while this is very inspiring, it's not really enough for us to just be inspired. If you're a Christian, and in fact, if you're not a believer, this is an incredible story, and there's so much more to it that if you read through those first 2 books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you can read for yourself. But whenever we watch someone do the right thing, whenever we see a leader say no to themselves so they can say yes to the people they're leading, it's always inspiring. But if you're a Jesus follower, if you're a Christian, it's not enough for us to be inspired by that kind of greatness, because it's actually required of you. And here's why. 1,000 years later, 20 miles north of where all this took place in the city of Jerusalem, Jesus would model this kind of greatness in the most unusual way. But there would be a twist. And here's what happened. John, who was there, who's an eyewitness of all of these things, who lived to be an old man and gives us some of the greatest literature about Jesus, most of which became part of our New Testament. And here's what he wrote about this incredible moment when Jesus modelled what David modelled. But Jesus modelled it with a twist. It was just before Passover, and the Passover festival is when the Jewish people would celebrate once a year that God led the nation out of Egyptian slavery. This was a big celebration for Jewish people and continues to be so today. And Jesus, during this Passover, had gathered all of his disciples in what's referred to as the upper room, the special room where they would meet for this Passover meal. John, who was there, says this, That somehow Jesus knew in this moment that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Jesus knows that in just a few hours he's going to be arrested, he's going to be tried, he's going to be crucified. This is after being chased all over Judea and all over Galilee for the last 3 years by the people that were supposed to identify the Messiah, but who missed it. And he would be arrested by those he came to save, but they would arrest him and crucify him anyway. And like David, he's been anointed by God, and during this same meal, he would inaugurate a brand new covenant. Not between God and the 12 tribes of Israel. He would introduce a brand new covenant. In fact, it's called the New Covenant. It's why we call the second half of our English Bibles the New Testament. He would initiate a brand new covenant between God and all of humankind, but not through the blood of an animal, but through his own blood. And in this moment, this is like the hinge moment in history between the time when he worked and functioned as a Jewish rabbi and miracle worker to the moment when it dawns on Jesus in some crazy, mysterious way that perhaps he didn't know before. We don't know the answers to all of that, but John says in this moment, he recognized that the end had come. He recognized that this was a very, very special moment. And here's what John said. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. In this moment, Jesus has the power without the crown, the authority and without the title. He's holding all the cards. And John tells us, so he got up. And now here's the question. What do you do when you're king? What do you do when you're the most powerful, influential person in the room? What do you do when you've got the whole world in your hands? And John says he got up. He got up from the meal and he took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel round his waist. And the disciples, they just couldn't believe it. There's so much emotion in the room right now. There's a moan and a sigh and a groan. In fact, Peter's going to say, no, you're not doing that. We have people for that. We have slaves for that. We have servants for that. Put your clothes back on. You are not about to do what it looks like you're about to do. You are not about to wash our feet. You're a rabbi. You're our teacher. Besides, we've seen what you can do with those hands, and you're not about to use those hands to wash our feet. Jesus just smiled and ignored all of them. And after that, he poured water into a basin and begins to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And then he put on his robe that showed, yes, he was a rabbi, that yes, he had authority, and he sat down. And I wonder if he had a grin on his face, and I think that nobody said a word because they didn't need to say anything. He had just preached the most powerful lesson that he would preach to that group of people. He had just done something that was so obvious. And what he meant by what he did, that he didn't need to say anything, but he did say something. And maybe he said it for our benefit too. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. If I am not too good to wash your feet, then you're not too good to wash one another's feet. And he would say to us, if you're a Jesus follower, in those moments when you think you're something, in those moments when you think you're somebody, when someone hands you the keys, when they show you to the corner office, and when you get the opportunity of a lifetime, when they set on your head the crown, in that moment, look for more feet to wash. Because perhaps the greatest reflection of our maturity, perhaps the thing that says more about our maturity than anything else, is what we do when we have authority, when we have power, when we have influence. Perhaps the thing that says more about you than anything else that can be said about you is what you do when it dawns on you that you have the power, that you have the authority, that you have the influence. It's how we respond when it dawns on us that we are the most powerful person in the classroom, at home, or in the boardroom. And let's be honest, at some level, in some capacity, somebody's already handed us the keys, haven't they? Because you've got a title. For somebody, you wear a crown. You're a father, you're a mother, you're a husband and you're a wife, you're a manager and you're an owner, or you're the captain of a team. Whatever it is. Maybe you're just the big brother, you're the big sister, you're the chair of trustees, or you're a board member, you're an admin assistant, but you have authority. And we would do well to embrace the greatness that David learned the hard way and that Jesus modelled for us. And that is that when you are the most powerful person in the room, you leverage your power for the benefit of the other people in the room. That when you're the most powerful person in the room, when you are the most powerful person in the relationship, you leverage your power for the benefit of the other people in the relationship. This is what David learned in the desert. This is what Jesus modelled for us. And if you are a Christian, this is required of you, as it is required of me. Because after all, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Imagine if all of us with this influence led that way. Imagine if all of us lived that way. And history tells us that that kind of selfishness changed the world once, and perhaps it would again. When it dawns on you that you've got the power, that you've got the authority, and that you've got the influence, look for a way to wash more feet. Look for a way to leverage that power, that authority, and that influence for the benefit of the other people in the room. That's what your Saviour did for you, and he did it for me too. Shall we pray? Lord, I thank you for the narrative of David and how that's been preserved over years. And I thank you for the life of Jesus and what we can learn from both of these stories, the story of David and the story of Jesus, and how we can come to know that it is the truth and it is the way of life that we have been called to. And I pray for us today, Lord, that we live our lives wherever we have power, wherever we have influence, and wherever we have authority, to be the light bearers for you, Jesus, that we may shine who you are in all that we do. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I hope that's blessed you. I hope that you can see that as Christians, we don't just make it up as we go along. We look to our brothers and sisters who've gone before us, and we most certainly always look to the life of Jesus to learn how we can deal with pretty much any situation and any circumstance that we come across, because we're not the first person or the first people to go through what we have gone through. So I just pray for you today. I pray that you have peace and that you have calmness, and that you may find someone's feet to wash today. Go in peace.